Denialism is the belief that survivors of the residential schools are either lying or greatly exaggerating their stories about their experiences. Denialists don't believe that the residential schools themselves didn't exist, but rather that they had good intentions and that they weren't really all that bad. Denialism has already been inflated so much that it is discussed a lot in modern politics, with people in government getting kicked out for making harmful comments on the side of denialism, such as Dallas Brody. The residential schools in Canada were incredibly harmful institutions that tortured children on a multi-daily basis. The goals of these schools were to eradicate Indigenous culture and ideas, then force a more white and Christian appearance and lifestyle onto them. And denying that these institutions were as awful as they were is more than simply disrespectful, but evil to an extent. Denialism is just one branch of a spiraling ideology of hatredness and bigoted ideas. Denialism destroys all the years of work of attempting reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada. It brings severe pain back onto survivors and forces them to go back onto issues that should have been resolved years ago. The residential schools were implemented because the government in Canada wanted to force Indigenous children to assimilate to what they viewed as correct, and they wanted to eradicate their culture. The government took children from their homes, forced them into small rooms with one another, and effectively tortured them for years on end, either until they got released from their prison or until they died. The children were forced to wear clothes that weren't theirs from a culture that wasn't theirs, forced to have their hair cut in ways completely foreign to them for pretty much no reason other than to conform to arbitrary Christian ideas of the people running the schools. The children were treated as if they were prisoner slaves, forced to do physical labor all day and barely doing any productive schoolwork, leaving them with incredibly low reading levels at high ages. And once the labor ended, they were tortured and raped, typically by guards and priests. Of course, every survivor's experience is unique, and it's important not to attribute these facts to everybody, but that's simply to paint a picture of how terrible these institutions really were. Denialism does not deny the existence of residential schools in their entirety, but they deny the facts of the stories told inside the buildings and misrepresent and downplay what the goals of the schools really were. They say that survivors are greatly exaggerating when they tell stories about what happened, or that they're just simply lying about their experiences in the schools. Denialists also ask for evidence that is either unethical to try and retrieve or that is nearly impossible to get. Denialists also deny the fact that there are corpses in unmarked graves in several residential schools, but most specifically the Kamloops Indian Residential School that got into a big controversy in 2023. Some have even gone as far to say we need to dig up the graves to prove that there are in fact corpses and not a mistake with the tools that they used to find the graves in the first place. Many denialists also insist that Indigenous parents saw the residential schools as positives and that they wanted to send their children there because they thought it would benefit them. The residential schools were clearly not positive in any way whatsoever, but these denialists continue to say that the facts have been altered or falsified somehow to show residential schools in a bad light. Denialism started on the same day the schools themselves did, but it just took on a bit of a different form. Denialism wasn't as it was today, with people saying the survivors were lying because the survivors weren't allowed to speak out about their experiences. So denialism mostly existed through propaganda about the schools being good for the children, and that the public should only ever see the schools as good. Posters and other things of the sort back then had slogans just written all over them, such as, "Kill the Indian, save the man." That would give you a pretty good idea of the state of things back then. Denialism was also heavily perpetrated by the government by not allowing the survivors to speak out without punishment. The government and heads of the schools heavily pushed for censorship against what the survivors had to say. Denialism has skyrocketed quite a bit in recent years, but most especially after the discovery of the unmarked graves in Kamloops Indian Residential School. Many people have decided that the facts being told about the situation were incorrect, and that there is no evidence of unmarked graves or any attempts of genocide whatsoever, whether cultural or literal. It is believed by denialists that the soil anomalies found on the grounds of the residential school are simply anomalies unrelated to the missing children or graves. To add to that, stories of missing children, according to denialists, are falsified and were simply children forgotten in passing generations. It is also said that before 1990, all the stories told from people who survived residential schools were positive. Denialism has grown large enough to the point that people that are part of the Legislative Assembly in BC have begun to repeat the main talking points, greatly offending Indigenous peoples and Indigenous leaders in government and undermining the efforts of years of attempting reconciliation. Dallas Brody, the aforementioned member of Legislative Assembly, continues to make harmful comments on the side of denialism, going against the idea that the unmarked graves are actually unmarked graves. Roseanne Casimir, a First Nations leader in BC, says that Brody's comments threaten the safety of Indigenous peoples, although some others say that Brody's comments are mostly made for a spotlight, to get most of the attention among a sea of other upcoming politicians. In a small town in BC named Powell River, there was a lot of discourse relating not just to denialism, but several related branching topics. In a library, where people were speaking about changing the town's name because of its controversial nature, a political scientist named Francis Widdowson had quite the public freakout involving the idea that trans people didn't exist and other peculiar thoughts like that. I bring this up because this is one of many stories of entire communities and towns going into discourse amongst themselves on topics similar to this about marginalized communities, especially residential school denialism. Denialism and controversies similar also made an incredibly large impact on the town and Kamloops where the unmarked graves were discovered, where people in the community were split, whether it was because they didn't want to believe something of this nature happened so close to their home, or they were just bigoted, I suppose. This caused people to start doing irrational things, like attempting to dig up the graves. Quote, "Some came in the middle of the night carrying shovels. They said they wanted to see for themselves if children are buried there." Denialism is also used as a tool to prey on Indigenous communities, to get the majority to not care about Indigenous land rights so that big oil tycoons and other climate-destroying projects could happen on separated Indigenous land. An example of this is Aaron Gunn, a federal conservative candidate making dismissive comments about residential schools and the impact they made. This same man is also backed by several oil tycoons that give him money to continue running. Denialism is very harmful, especially to survivors of residential schools. Denialism brings pain back to those who already experienced suffering and trauma in the residential schools many years ago. People like Geraldine Shingus were not allowed to speak out about what happened to them until many years after they got released from the schools, and denying that her experience happened the way that she says she did. Quote, "They're denying my truth, they're denying my abuses that I experienced in residential school, the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual and sexual abuse I experienced." But it's not just the survivors that are affected by denialism in recent years. Entire Indigenous communities have found the entire idea completely offensive and disrespectful to Indigenous culture and says that it, quote, "completely undermines reconciliation." Roseanne Casimir says that denialism, through the BC MLA Dallas Brody, quote, "undercuts the standards of respect and integrity required of someone in public office." Brody has made comments on social media dismissive of facts relating to unmarked graves and dead children at residential schools and dismissive of Indigenous history and culture generally. Roseanne takes it upon herself to call out Brody as chief herself. Survivors' voices are one of the biggest historical records relating to residential schools, and attempting to silence them through denialism creates a, quote, "rhetoric that erases history." Denialism is just one string in a web of bigoted ideas. Ideas like hate against LGBTQ or more Indigenous racism, residential school related or not. I bring this up because I would like to go more in detail about Powell River and how a simple act in attempting to reconcile Indigenous racism from over 100 years ago sparked a wide debate across the town and caused a huge public freakout by Canadian political scientist Francis Widdowson, as previously mentioned. Francis had quite the meltdown in a public library when the town was talking about changing its name, because the town was named after the superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs for BC from 1872 to 1889. Francis, alongside her racist talking points on the side against changing the town's name, also spoke about how she thinks Indigenous names are too difficult for anybody not Indigenous to pronounce, and also that trans people aren't real. But it's not just this town having these debates. If this singular freakout was enough to spark several news stories, then it's not too far-fetched to think that other towns named after racists might be facing the same issues. And it's clear that the other side is also upset at how long it's taking for towns or places with racist names or places named after racist people to get their name changed. It's clear that denialism is an increasing issue, and it doesn't seem to be on track to slow down. And the future doesn't seem very bright due to the fact that denialism against residential schools, one of the most talked about and researched topics within the last many years, is picking up speed and getting used as a political tool. Though, as bad as I believe the web of ideas relating to denialism is, it is crucial that it is not made illegal. I say this because one of the few weapons we have against big monopolies and government power is our voice, and once we start willingly giving that up, we stand no chance against a society filled with breached privacy and peering eyes from companies that use us and extort us.